You're watching BATV, bringing Brookline home.
Hello, I'm Karma Kitai, and I'm your host for Alivelihood, New Adventures as We Age. And we interview people over age 50 who are doing some new and wonderful things. Today I'm going to introduce you to Judith Steinberg. She is Poet Laureate of Brookline, Mass. And welcome, Judy.
Thank you, Karma. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me as a guest.
That's nice, yeah. So we are going to want to talk about how you got to be Poet Laureate of Brookline, and the first one at that, right?
Yes. Thanks to Zvi Sessling, who was instrumental in pursuing that idea with the selectmen. And Zvi is a well-known poet in Brookline, and he edits a magazine called Muddy River.
Right. So he was the one who kind of pushed for having a Poet Laureate.
Yes, he
at
did.
All?
Yes, and then the selectmen were brought along with that and eventually approved it. Yes.
So what does the Poet Laureate do in Brookline, Massachusetts?
Well, when I was selected, which was in April of 2012, I was given a list of things that I might be interested in doing, but I would say, to sum it up, that that I would reach out to the community, all ages in the community, to use poetry and maybe song as a way to engage the community together and appreciate the town and its great literary activity. Also, I could show up at different events with or without poems that were appropriate and be invited to different locations in the town.
Yeah. So do you know, have other surrounding towns have they had a Poet Laureate before?
Oh yes, I think Boston has had one and for quite a while now, in Cambridge, and I think it's just becoming a way to reach out to the community, another way, in a way, of community building through a literary endeavor. And I could tell you a little bit about some of the things that I've tried out since I began my term.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, in the beginning, last spring, a year ago spring, I started with a workshop at Griggs Park, one of my favorite little parks in Brookline, and it was called Right Under Willows, since the park is encircled by willows. And a small amount of people came, maybe 15 adults and children, and we spent the beautiful May afternoon writing poetry under willows and drawing the willow trees. And that was one of the beginning things.
So when you do something like that, Judy, do you give people kind of instructions or guidelines about what to do?
Yes, I made suggestions, I gave them guidelines, ways to begin if people felt nervous about writing a poem. Other people were very comfortable writing, so they could take off however they wanted. And we also used big pieces of foam board that they could draw on first if they wanted to, or afterwards. And we just sat in the grass and listen to the sounds around the park, watch the willows, and wrote. And after that event, I hosted a number of readings that involved people from Brookline, poets from Brookline, and I also planned a number of things for the following fall. And I offered 2 poetry forums for teachers of students in Brookline. One was for K through 5 teachers and one was for 6 through 8 teachers. And I invited teachers who were very experienced to come and present their favorite poetry units. So we had a wide range of offerings in those 2 poetry forums.
Right.
And that was really fun.
What was the goal of that program, would you say?
It was to expose newer teachers to the experienced teachers' love for poetry reading, writing, and performance, and how to show them how they could integrate that into the curriculum that they were already teaching. And, you know, also just to affirm the value of poetry in the classroom. And I think it really did that. There's a lot of enthusiasm for poetry in the Brookline schools and also the other private schools in around our town too. Yeah. And after that, then I planned some things for the fall of my first term, and those included a reading of poems from around the world, and they were poems in languages other than English. And so we ended up having 19 readers, 5 of whom were students, and they read in 9 different languages, and some of those were very exotic, Farsi and Romanian, and it was really an event that reflected the diversity of our town and the fact that many people come from cultures where poetry is more valued even than right here. So it was a wonderful night, and we'll be having another one of those on December 12th, The World of Poetry in Brookline.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
Then in the spring of this year, I started to think of other ways to reach out to the community and really focus on Brookline itself. And so through the schools and the senior center and other organizations, I invited people to submit poems and songs that were related to Brookline places and people. And over the spring and summer, I gathered together maybe 60 or 70 poems by people of all ages, all the way from 8 years old to 80. And then during the summer, I learned slowly how to make a website, and I was able to publish most of those poems. And at the end of the show, you can see where to find them and read them. And as a final event for that, probably not final, but the next event, we had just 2 weeks ago a reading of poems about Brookline places and people, and we had 30 readers again who ranged from 8 to 80 years old, and it was a really wonderful, well-attended reading. And I think that was really an effort that reached out in many, many ways to the community. There's a group at the Senior Center called Seasoned Writers, and they were very well represented at this reading with poems they had written too.
Right. Well, you know, when we talked a week or so ago, you told me some of your background in all this, and I think I said, well, it sounds like you were a shoo-in for this particular job in Brookline, that, you know, maybe there are other people who've done as much, but you've just done so much for years and years, both writing and teaching, and not only in Brookline, of course, right? So why don't you talk about some of what you've done before you became a poet laureate?
Well, it started back when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and when I first learned to write a little bit in a small town in western Pennsylvania. And my father really liked verse, and he also played the violin, interested in music. And when I was old enough, he showed me how to write birthday card verses, so sentimental feelings that rhymed. And I specialized in that for several years, I'd say. I wrote birthday cards and anniversary cards. And
so do you mean you specialized as a child in
that? Yes, occasional verse, that's what we would call it now, occasional verse. And also at that time, my Aunt Faye, who was my father's sister, it was right after the Second World War, and she came to live with us, and she stayed in my room too. And she really liked poetry, and she read to me, and we exchanged poems. And I think that as I got a little older, she had a large influence on me also. And then in high school, I went to a small school in Pittsburgh, and I had a wonderful teacher. Her name was Helen Moore, and she was my creative writing teacher, and she really was the first person who introduced me to the great poets of America and the British poets, and fostered my own writing. She was very interested in the writing that I wanted to do, and I think that she was really influential in shaping what I would become. And then in college, I was able to study with X.J. Kennedy, who's a wonderful poet who lives in one of the suburbs of Boston, and he's very active in the poetry community. And I even took a course with Brookline's own David Ferry, the eminent David Ferry, when I was in college, and he was a young professor at Wellesley. So those were some of the shapers of my later time. Then, as an adult, I continued to study with poets in the Boston area. Some of those were Ruth Whitman, who lived in Brookline and wrote many books of poetry, and Kathleen Spivak. And as I taught more and more in the circles of the schools surrounding Brookline and Boston,
and when you say taught, you mean you taught poetry? Right?
I did, although I actually taught as a specialist in Brookline 1 day a week for 21 years. And I taught in the Wenham Public Schools for 4 years as a visiting poet, but that was full time.
Right, so this has been in your blood almost forever.
Yes, it's really, it's been a long time.
Right. Do you suppose that you imagined as a young woman that you were going to make a life of poetry?
I think I could hardly imagine such a thing because at the time, I think my parents wanted me to have a career that might earn some money. And so I actually majored in economics, and I went on to work for McKinsey & Company, a consulting firm in the research department for a number of years, and that was quite rewarding too. But I think that because that period of time was the late 60s, there was a lot of turmoil and political strife, and the arts were a big part of that, and I was wooed to the side of the arts. And so by the early 70s, I really had committed to working in classrooms with children and being part of the poetry community.
Right, yeah. So I know you've not only taught in Brookline and, I guess towns like that, but you've also taught in an inner city school, haven't you?
I have. I've taught, I've done 4 long partnerships in Boston schools, and that has been through an organization I helped to co-found, which is Troubadour, Literacy Through Writing and Song, and I co-founded that with Victor Coburn long ago, and he's still the executive director.
Songwriter.
Yes,
right?
Songwriter, producer, and teacher in literacy through songs.
Right.
And so some of those partnerships lasted for 4 years, going not every day, but part-time.
Yeah. So I know you taught in a school with, I think it was 5th graders, right?
Yes, I did.
And we actually have a little clip of a young boy reading a poem that he wrote in one of your classes. Right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
in the 5th grade classroom at the Taylor School in Mattapan.
Yeah.
Title of my poem is Skateboarding. Pushing and powerfully pumping, feeling the freezing cold air rushing on my face, taking my breath away. Feeling that I have all control of my motions and emotions. I start to bend my knees, getting set for the trick. Feeling the hard, scaly grip tape with the sound of my wheels rolling over the cracks on the sidewalk. I pop the tail, getting ready for the trick. My heart is racing. I'm in the air, seeing everything around me. Bunch of kids and thousands of cars going by, like the whole world just paused for a second, then slam.
So I think you told me a big proportion of the children in this school are of Haitian heritage, right?
Yes, maybe 60-65% of the children came from Haiti, and maybe another 20% from other Caribbean countries.
Right.
So most of the children were English language learners, and the teachers were just wonderful in using many writing genres to help children learn English. And that particular video was really a record of how children felt about their writing in relationship to their learning English during their time there.
To learning English.
Yes, yes.
So what's that like for you to revisit that little boy? This is after 6 or 7 years.
Yes, it
right?
is. Well, those children were just amazing, and they were so enthusiastic about writing. And I learned a lot about, by teaching in the Boston schools as well as in the suburbs, I learned ways to teach that fit with what the ways that teachers presented things to children and to children who were learning English. And sometimes I brought in poems that were in French or Russian or Creole. And other languages too, because there were many languages spoken in the schools and are in Brookline too. That's another thing. We have so many languages in the Brookline schools.
Very multicultural
Yes,
here too.
And so actually one of the products that Victor Coburn and I made together was called Where I Come From, and it's a collection of songs and poems from all over the world in their first languages with translation. And so we could use some of that material in schools as well as our traditional teaching.
Right. Huh. Okay, so you also began to publish books at some point. And when was your first book published?
Well, I started making books when I was a little girl, just like kids do now in kindergarten and first grade. They write their stories and do the art and bind them together. And I did that when I was little too, and I always loved to make books. And so I guess my first book was published right out of college when my brother, a photographer, Carrie Walensky, and I made a book together, and we said, oh, let's just take it to New York and see if we could get it published. And it turned out we did. So that was the first book. It was called Marshmallow Worlds. And then after that, I published a series of poetry books. There are 5 in all. The most recent is called Writing My Will, and 3 textbooks that address teaching poetry in the classroom with different age children.
Yeah, so you've been very prolific about your writing and publishing, and I would imagine that publishing poetry, especially these days, is not so easy. Is that
No, it's
true?
never been easy actually, but I think now there are many other alternatives, and with electronic communication, people are able to get their work out, and there are many ways that people reach a public that we didn't used to have, and one of those is performing their poems in cafes and so forth. So I think that everyone feels that they have a little more access to an audience than poets used to.
Yeah. So do you like to go that route of performing your poems?
I am, let's see, more comfortable reading in a more traditional way, but I encourage my students to take a chance.
So what's a more traditional way?
Oh, reading with expression, but maybe not so much body language. But I think that my colleague Elizabeth McKim is a great performer of poetry, and there are many groups now in Boston who are teams of performers and the slam poets, and there have been, it's really brought poetry to such a wider audience. It's very exciting how poetry has changed over the years.
Yeah. So you have a poem that you are going to read us.
I
right?
do. This is a poem that is the first poem in my book, Writing My Will, which is a collection of poetry and some essays. And this poem is called What I Want to Give Away. What I want to give away are certain words that have run through my life like weather or tides, repeating themselves. Godisha, I borrowed once from a woman, and galaxy, Sajura, words whose sounds fly away from their meanings like blinding sparks, or meanings that have not yet grown their words, merely hovered near me with a kind of heat, and poems I have loved like sisters, their lines clothing me in embroidered cotton skirts, and tart taste of blackberries right off the backyard vines, the smell of the cottage at Keezer Lake, just opened in June, a permanent musk, with spiders still curled in the window frames, little balls of lace. Who will have these jewels? Overlook the heirlooms, china, silver, rings, for the real treasures, my darlings. Believe me, what I am giving out, sting, scent, and the estate of the soul is the only testament of worth. Being of song, mind, and body, I make my will. Judith. Thank you.
So, what do you suppose gave you the impulse to write this poem?
Well, in my family, and probably in a lot of families, your parents say, well, someday you'll have this ring, or someday you'll have your grandmother's china, or this lace tablecloth came from Belgium during the war. And those are things actually that I have received some of from the generations who preceded me, and I value those. But when I was thinking about my children when they were younger, and just the kinds of things that I really valued, I thought that language and the power of words and the music of poems and songs, that those are the things that I wanted to make sure that they would value after I'm gone. And they'll have their tablecloths and everything too, but it's really the power and the emotion of language that I want to make sure they value.
Yeah. So do you feel that they do value words?
I think they value me, and they have their own specialties, and yes, I think they value words, but in their own ways. They've each developed their own areas of love and expertise. So
Yeah.
now I just try to influence my grandchildren.
I was gonna say, you have several grandchildren.
Yes,
right?
I do. And
Four, right? Four.
Yes, and some step grandchildren too. So yes, and two of them live here and actually go to school in Brookline. So just following the family through.
Yeah. So what I was thinking as you were reading that poem, that I have started to paint and create visual art in the past few years.
Yes.
And I have noticed that since I started doing that, I feel as if I'm a much more keen observer visually. And I wonder if that connects with you in terms of writing poetry, or the way you teach poetry to children, for example, about being a keen observer.
I think it really does. I mean, I feel I'm in the world maybe 80%, and that's a pretty high percentage of the time. And I spend a lot of time observing the natural world, especially in my times when I'm staying in Maine by a lovely lake. And there I have spent a lot of time observing the wildlife and writing about it, and really and studying so I could learn more and write with some knowledge. And always the natural world, even in the city, affects me so much. The weather and the creatures and our wildlife in Brookline, all of those things, the birds flying over, and our wonderful resources such as Hall's Pond and all of our parks that we have. And those places are treasures that help everybody feel comforted and soothed, and also inspire the artists of our town.
Yeah. So it sounds like you enjoy writing outside then, huh?
I do, sometimes in a canoe.
That's when you're up at the lake
Yes,
in
right.
Maine, right?
Or, just walking around the ponds here, and sometimes I have a little notepad. But I think there are phrases that move through my head that I try to catch on to, and also I'm listening for the sounds of how words go together to make music, their own music, and how that might fit into a poem that I'm writing.
Right.
And as far as how that affects my teaching, I really do stress observing carefully and in the natural world, using your five senses, and also elevating those images through simile, metaphor, personification, all kinds of figurative language, so that you observe, you record using all of your senses, and then you elevate the language through some of the more sophisticated literary techniques. And then the sounds of words too, such as alliteration or just the repetition of vowels, that those are things that I want children and adult writers to hear in their own heads and then in their writing.
Right, yeah. So I imagine in your textbooks you explain some of this.
Yes,
right?
yes. And two of my textbooks I co-wrote. One was with Elizabeth McKim, Beyond Words, Writing Poems with Children. And there's a lot about the oral beginnings of poetry, especially because Elizabeth McKim has used that technique so much in her teaching. And then I co-wrote a book called Reading and Writing Poetry with Teenagers with one of Brookline's longtime teachers, Frederick Lown, who just recently retired. And that was to cover teaching in 7th through 12th grade. And then I wrote a book for teachers of K through 4, which were just really focused on younger children, and starting with holding concrete objects such as seashells or flowers or little animals, and then moving toward more abstract ideas as you move towards 4th and 5th grade. So that's some of the technique. And I think my approach to teaching is to think about the broad themes of writers and how you're going to give meaning to those themes through the literary techniques. So there's really themes and techniques, and how are those going to mesh to make the most beautiful work?
Yeah. So we have just a moment left, but
Yes.
I don't want to end without asking you what's next for you.
Well, I think when my term as poet laureate comes to a completion, which will be next spring, then I will go back to working on my own writing more, and I'm working on a collection of journal writings and essays that have to do with my relationship to the natural world. And I really like to shape that into some form that could be enjoyed by other people. And also to maybe revise some textbooks that are used widely across the country to just update them a little bit more.
Right.
And continue playing with the grandchildren.
Well, thank you, Judy. We will have some websites at the end of this segment so that people can look things up about you.
Thank you so much, Karma. It's been a pleasure, and it's a real honor to be on your show.
I'm
I
thrilled that
appreciate
you were
it.
able to do it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so join us next time when we will have a new guest on Alivelihood.